Hey everybody. Okay, so last day of video lectures. I noticed that both of the previous ones have been very long, so I'm going to keep this one short. It's 10:25 when I started, so 30 minutes, we're going to be in and out. Um, all right, so we talked a bit about Saul a lot last week, so we're going to go back and do some stuff with David and his heir, Solomon. So one thing that we normally do at this point in the class is have a longer discussion about history and how, historical facts and truths are determined and things like that. But I think that's a conversation we should probably have in person. Um, so I'm going to hold off on that. So instead, what we're going to look at today is more so kind of the literary representations of David. So if we remember that we're in the Deuteronomistic history right now, um, the Deuteronomistic history starts with the conquest, moves to its high point, the sort of ideal, the golden age, is this period of the United Monarchy. Now, the United Monarchy, as I mentioned in the last lecture, is short-lived. It's really just David and Solomon in that sense. But this idea that what's called the Davidic dynasty is kind of like how sometimes in the United States we think back to, the age of the founding fathers. That was the perfect time or something like that. Maybe not everybody thinks it, but it's that sort of gesture in that way. The Davidic dynasty is the highest point for the Deuteronomistic history. It's when everything is going good. And we see this in a lot of ways. And remember how I kind of gave that triad of following the laws, worshiping only Yahweh, the conquering of the land, and the temple. Those three things are kind of the most important goals for the Deuteronomistic history. And we get those traditions sort of outlined in these texts about David and Solomon. So we're going to go through some of this. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to email me, and then we'll pick all this back up. I know we're a little bit behind in the course schedule, but we're gonna iron that out in person on Monday. So we will be back in the classroom on Monday. I'm very, very happy about that. I'm sure you all are too, despite how awesome all of these video lectures are, right? Okay, so of course, another slideshow. It's helpful. All right, so King David, and we read a lot about Saul and talked a lot about Saul in the last lecture. But during most of Saul's reign as king, David is still there, and we get a lot of traditions about David. And I have up here sort of four ways that we are sort of David is presented to us. And we're going to go through some of them. The mighty warrior one is a little bit less kind of difficult to understand, and that's one thing about these texts too, right? Well, you might not know the characters and you're like, oh, who's, Hishay? I don't remember that guy. More or less, the texts are pretty easy to understand. You know what's going on. So in that sense, I kind of want to keep working away on this idea of, well, what do you do? How do you interpret a text that's basically just a straightforward narrative about David did this thing? And we're going to keep working on characterization, how characters are built up through multiple traditions in order to give us this sort of full-fledged look at their life and what they did in that regard. So the first version of David that we get is as an underdog. Now I say an underdog, but we do have other traditions where even from the start he's really gifted in a lot of ways, but he's an underdog. And this begins to be sort of displayed to us in that scene in 1 Samuel 16 where David ends up being anointed as king. Samuel comes to the sons of Jesse and he's looking at all the sons, and David, this person who's going to become king, he's not even there. He's off tending the sheep. They're thinking, oh, this guy's not going to want to talk to David at all, right? He's the youngest. He's the weakest, all of those things. So he's not even like there. But there's an interesting line in here that we want to talk about. And it's Samuel is coming. Samuel is there, and as one of the sons named Eliab comes up, and Samuel thinks, surely the Lord's anointed is now before the Lord. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. Okay, so a couple things here. We didn't talk about this in Saul's tradition, but when Saul is being chosen as king, he's described as being sort of head and shoulders taller than everybody around him. Um, he's big, he's physically intimidating, he's attractive, he's charismatic. Um, and that's kind of an important thing for a king, right? If you're a villager who's far off and you don't know the king, but you see him once whenever he's traveling through or something, and you're like, God, that guy's tall. Obviously he's better, he's stronger, all of this. So in that sense, Samuel is being told here not to make the same mistake he made with Saul in that regard. Now, another thing that's going on in this line real quick is when it says the Lord looks on the heart. We think of the heart as our emotional center, right? Valentine's Day is coming up. Everybody's hearts are very full. But in the Hebrew conception of, where emotions come from and activities and all of that, the heart is more so your decision-making center. It's what we would, use as our brain. He's got a good brain. That would be this good heart. It's somebody who's thoughtful, somebody who the way that they carry themselves, not just in an emotional sense, but also in a sort of deliberative sense. It originates from your heart. Again, hearkening back to the stuff about Pharaoh and the hardening of the heart and making it sort of this bad thing for him. Okay, so if I'm going to make this quick, we got to keep on moving, but that's what's going on with the heart and with David. He is sort of portrayed as an underdog already in this scene. He's not even there whenever Samuel is starting to choose the new king. Now, of course, the other one, and a story that you all probably love and know pretty well, is David and Goliath. In this story, David is completely characterized as an underdog. He's the little brother. He's not even at the battle. He comes to the battle and his brothers sort of receive him negatively. And he's just there, kind of asking questions, what's going on? And one of his brothers says, I see the evil that's in your heart. David, if you're the youngest sibling in your family, you probably had stuff like this happen. He's like, what did I do wrong? I just want to know. So there, he's portrayed as scrawny. He's not part of the military. And then he's also characterized over against Goliath, whereas David is a boy who hasn't been trained in sort of military arts, whereas Goliath has been training for this day since he was a child. Goliath is thought to be one of these group of individuals called the Nephilim. The Nephilim comes from a verb naphah, which means grow. And so essentially their name kind of means the growing ones. It's supposed to kind of refer to the fact that they never stop growing. They keep getting taller and taller. They're kind of legendary figures who are kind of like giants. So we have this giant Goliath on one side. We have the sheep herder David on the other. Whenever he gets introduced to Saul, David is sort of being clothed in Saul's armor and he can't even wear it. So he takes it all off. So again, we have David as this underdog who has one critical thing on his side, right? And that's sort of this blessing and guidance of Yahweh. David is pretty frequently characterized as a man after Yahweh's own heart, which sort of signals the connection that they have between one another. And that's also part of the way that David is able to accomplish all of these mighty feats. So he's continually characterized as this underdog. Now, in the Goliath story, you all know what happens. David takes his sling and a rock, he throws it. And the verb that's used there and the way that it works out in the Hebrew is that David hits him with the stone and it says in his eyebrows. So it's supposed to be right here. But eyebrows and brow in general is a term that's usually used metaphorically to describe someone who's very stubborn. So we see here David's sort of meekness is overcoming the egotistical, sort of Goliath's out there talking trash to everybody all this time. David is in there and he sort of severs that sort of sense of pride, if that makes sense. Now, the verb that's used there is also, it means it's sunk into his head. It's the same verb used to describe the chariot sinking during the Exodus story. So we kind of have, you can imagine like a slow-mo image of this. David throws it, and it's like you get the side view of the stone hitting Goliath and all that. But then again, David goes into this encounter as an underdog, And through sort of his faith and his, following after Yahweh's own heart, he's able to come out of it with a greater stature than he had coming into it. Now, the last one there, David on the run from Saul. These are a collection of stories where David is sort of ostracized from the court. There's interesting things going on there where we get, themes about David's mercy being developed. But more or less, it's just this idea that David is on the run from Saul. So once again, he's an underdog in terms of this political drama going on. Now, we also know David is a mighty warrior. I talked a little bit about David and the 100 foreskins as sort of a bride price. But another interesting thing about David is when he gets kicked out of the court, he ends up going and working as a mercenary for the Philistines. And the Philistines are the enemies of Israel. David, as a mercenary, is kind of going around raiding towns and bringing spoil back to his Philistine boss, we could say. And this is part of, we're beginning to see that David isn't always characterized as just fine or just a good person. He's a very complex, contradictory character. We'll come back to that, whenever we talk about people like Bathsheba in other stories. Now, but one of the most important aspects of David's kingship is that he's portrayed through and through as a faithful Yahwist. There's no traditions about David worshiping any other gods. And David does a couple of things that are quite important. One is that he recovers the Ark of the Covenant and he brings it to Jerusalem. And then the second one is towards the end of his life, he builds the altar there in Jerusalem. That is sort of like the kernel around which the rest of the temple is going to be built by Solomon. So David is sort of foundational in the establishing of that Deuteronomistic history's goal of one temple in Jerusalem, right? That temple, to give it legitimacy, was started by our great first king, right? So in that sense, yeah, he's a faithful Yahwist. But some of the more interesting stories that I think we get about David are these stories about him as kind of a real politician. So there's a small story, and I'm not even 100% sure that you all read it, about one of Jonathan's sons. Jonathan is Saul's son, David's, BFF, and all that. And one of Jonathan's sons is this guy named Mephibosheth. Now, at some point in the story, David has allowed all of Saul's sort of remaining sons, direct sons, to be killed. That's a long, convoluted tradition, but there is really only sort of grandsons who still have a claim to the throne. Now, they kill a lot of them, but David at one point asks, is there anybody that I can show sort of grace and mercy to from Saul's family? And somebody tells him that there is one son of Jonathan still alive, Mephibosheth. Now, Mephibosheth is disabled. And as we talked about quite a bit, people who aren't sort of that full picture of what, a human should be, they're not allowed to be priests. They're not going to be kings. They're ostracized from society a little bit. So if we look at this story kind of on face value, it might seem like, oh, David's being really, really nice, but he's also being shrewd. By showing this grace to Mephibosheth and letting Mephibosheth, live in the palace with him and all of that, he is sort of, on the one hand, saying, look how graceful and merciful I am, but he's also taking someone in who's not really a threat to him. Now, the kindness is great, but David in these stories is shown to be quite a shrewd politician. Now, on the other hand, he's also shown to sometimes be a politician that has a little bit of his power go to his head. And that's what we see in the David and Bathsheba story. Okay, one thing quick right before that, before we get into that. I said we'd talk about the Ark of the Covenant. This is a representation of the Ark of the Covenant. We have some descriptions of what it's supposed to look like. These are the cherubim on top of it. Right here in the middle is that thing that gets translated as the mercy seat, which is really just kind of a platter to offer sacrifices on. But an important thing here are these poles that go through. So you're not allowed to touch the Ark of the Covenant. It's dangerous in that regard. There's a story where it's about to fall off a wagon and somebody goes to touch it to keep it from falling and that person dies, right? So this Ark of the Covenant is in many ways thought to be not necessarily the presence of Yahweh, like we talked about in that Holy of Holies, but it is sort of a representative of Yahweh. This is what gets carried out into battle. Whenever David brings this to Jerusalem, that's a signal that Yahweh has chosen Jerusalem to be sort of the center of Israel in that regard. So it's a quite important relic. And now, most of the depictions we have of it in very modern times derived from Indiana Jones's representation of it, which in turn derives from Egyptian boxes that they found like this. But yeah, it's a very interesting relic with its own history about where it is today, if it still exists, whether it's in Ethiopia or it's hidden away in Europe. Those traditions, none of them have been proven true or false. It's kind of a open question. Where is it now? Okay, so let's go back to David and Bathsheba. So this occurs, I'm just going to bring the text up here in 2 Samuel 11. Now, you all probably knew the general sort of shape of this story, right? It's something that we are sometimes taught, but there's a couple things I want to highlight really quickly about David in relationship to Bathsheba. And this is in part what's going on in that David Penchansky article I had you all read, the 4 vignettes. Whenever we read the chapter 2 Samuel 11, we get a representation of Bathsheba where she is silent. She doesn't talk. She's not active. She's having things sort of done to her in terms of the way the narrative, like the individual sentences are structured. This is a story really more than anything between David and Uriah, right? They talk. They have this sort of tension going by, and Uriah is the one who experiences, being kind of murdered by warfare. So David arises from his couch and he's walking about on his roof, and he looks over and he sees Bathsheba bathing on the roof. Now, a lot of times this can be misunderstood that Bathsheba was kind of being a bit exhibitionist, perhaps. But this is how houses were shaped. This is how a house worked. You bathed on the roof. And it wasn't like a bathtub so much as it was, you go up there and you have your maid kind of pour water on you and stuff. Now, this scene has been showcased in a lot of movies about King David, one of which I believe is just called David and Bathsheba, but it might not be. It's really funny to me because David, the character, wears a Star of David on his chest, which, that's, a couple thousand years too early. But in that movie, one thing we see is that David and Bathsheba's relationship is portrayed very differently than it is in the text. In that movie, he calls Bathsheba to him and says, I want to marry you, and blah, 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 I love you, all this stuff. And she says, I will not have sex with you until we are, official. We got to do this by the book. And that's not what goes on in the biblical text. Now, one thing, Bathsheba is so passive, and one of the reasons she is so passive is because she's in a relationship that's very imbalanced in terms of its power. That when the king calls you, you have to come. You can't not come in that regard. And so while, I don't want to sort of make a claim that David raped Bathsheba, there is this imbalance in the power, and Bathsheba's character is a blank slate in that regard. So we get a sort of contradictory and convoluted picture of David from time to time, where he does these things that are wrong. But nonetheless, one thing that is persistently done in the characterization of David is that he's not afraid to ask for forgiveness from Yahweh. He recognizes when he does wrong. He is the king that apologizes, at least in the text. Okay. So this is a little thing here, and it's somewhat about Bathsheba's narrative, but also about other texts. Hebrew narrative style is usually called laconic, which is a word That means use or involving the use of a minimum amount of words, concise to the point of seeming rude or mysterious. And what that means is, whenever you all read a book, say you read, I don't know, but a narrative, young adult fiction or something, you're getting a lot of information given to you about the characters, their motivations, their backstories, what they're thinking at any given time. And that's not really in the Hebrew Bible. We get that occasionally, but it's really only for probably 4 to 5 characters, people like David. So we don't get that for every narrative we have. And David Pinchansky, who wrote the article we're supposed to read for today, has this line that the narrative is loath to reveal characters' inner voices. Now, this is just in part a stylistic difference. That's just how people wrote narratives in the ancient world. Over time, we start to develop that as a sort of cultural convention. But this is not, unique to Hebrew narrative. It's an ancient sort of convention in that way. But it brings up a good question that Pinchansky's article is trying to deal with, which is when we read these stories about David, we're obviously going to be thinking mainly about him, but we do have all these other characters. Paltiel is Michal's second husband, who ends up, Michal gets taken away from him. We have the handmaids in court. Jonathan, we get a little bit of his characterization, but not as much as you might imagine. Bathsheba, Abner, who is this general character in terms of a military general. What is he thinking about all this? He's seen Saul and he's seen Saul's sons be killed, and now he's aligned with David. He's got to have something going on. So in that sense, if you're reading these stories and you're like, what am I doing with this? It's just telling me a bunch of facts. One way to kind of enliven them is to, all right, I'm going to flip my perspective. I'm going to think about this event from the perspective of Jonathan, for example, something like that. Yeah. Okay. So all of these stories about David, which, it's hard to get through all of them. You could do weeks on all the stories. But all of these stories about David lead us to Israel's grandest king, and that is Solomon. So one thing that people sometimes think is funny is Solomon's name in Hebrew is Shlomo. Very funny to me. I remember whenever I learned this at like 15 years old, I used to call everybody Shlomo, me and my cousin Parker. But yeah, so that's Shlomo. But David has a lot of sons. David has a lot of wives, and he has even more sons. So it's not exactly directly obvious that Solomon would become the next king. In fact, David has some sons who are quite older than Solomon. And we see that in chapter 1 of the book of Kings. It's basically saying King David was old and advanced in years, and they couldn't keep him warm. So what they do is they bring a young woman to sleep with him. And it says, that he did not know her sexually, but it's sort of like somebody there to heat him up. Now, there's a bunch of stuff that happens after that with this son named Adonijah. And what Adonijah wants to do is marry that woman. Now, this is part of sort of masculinity in the ancient world. If you marry your father, the king's wife, you're sort of inheriting that power from him, whether it's the reputation, whether it's, sort of this idea of being sexually very sort of potent. That's a aspect of kingship ideology in the ancient world. So this is going on. And in these first 2 chapters, we end up seeing a sort of court drama where Bathsheba is no longer that passive woman we had from the story of David and Bathsheba. She's now sort of working behind the scenes in a role called the Queen Mother. And her role as the Queen Mother is to make sure that her son becomes the king. Eventually he does. In the presentation of Solomon's grandeur in chapters sort of 3 to 10 is supposed to be outlandish. So 30 cores of flour. I have these numbers here somewhere. 30 cores of flour, 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, and other things. These are all what Solomon's daily rations are said to be. Now, if you looked up what a size of a core was, these two together would be close to 10,000 pounds of flour a day. Right, that's not happening. 10 fat oxen a day. I've never dressed a cow or anything like that, but I imagine that the meat you get from one cow is enough to last you for probably months, not a day. So it's supposed to be grand. Now it also extends out. This period in Israelites monarchy has that big expansive map we talked about a couple weeks ago. Dominion from the Euphrates River all the way back down to the Mediterranean Sea. And he's continually portrayed as sort of bringing safety throughout the whole kingdom. And he also is known to have this flourishing of wisdom in Israel. So some of you might, have known this joke from a comic named John Mulaney. He talks about Solomon's wisdom. The two women, the two prostitutes come to him. One baby has died. They're conflicting ownership about the baby, and Solomon says, I know, we'll cut the baby in half. And then the one lady's like, no, give it to her. I don't want the baby to die. And all that. That sort of wisdom, well, to us, it might seem a little silly. Portraying it like that in the text is supposed to show that this king is kind of on a different level than the commoners, right? Solomon's able to be creative. We all know that Solomon gets this from that. He asks for wisdom, right? So in chapter 3, he goes to a place called Gibeah, which Jerusalem hasn't been sort of established yet. So he has to go to a high place, which is somewhat problematic. He offers incense and he has a dream, and Yahweh says, what do you want? I will give it to you. And what he says is, I want wisdom rather than I want power or wealth or, the death of my enemies, something like that. And what he says in that speech at one point is very interesting. And it's that he says, the way your text translates is basically something like, I'm young and inexperienced, but the literal words there, I do not know how to go in or go out, like walk out a door or come back in a door. He's trying to emphasize and downplay himself. And this question, or this response to the question, sits really well with Yahweh. So he says, I'm going to give it, all of it to you: wealth, power, and wisdom. So Solomon's biggest accomplishment and the true sort of climax of the entirety of the Deuteronomistic history is this building of the temple, right? We get a bunch of chapters about how he gets the wood to do it, and how he gets the craftsmen to do things, and what's in the temple and what's it like and all of that. And that sort of speech at the end of this in 1 Kings 8 is very Deuteronomistic. It has lots of the phrases that I was saying, are characteristic of the Deuteronomists. But one thing that it highlights there is that this temple wasn't always thought of by the Deuteronomists as the literal place where Yahweh lived. A lot of other temples in the ancient world were thought to be like the house of a god. But the Deuteronomist is also saying, that even this house isn't grand enough to contain Yahweh. So Yahweh lives in the heavens in that regard. But the temple, nonetheless, is this super important institution in Israel. Now, a lot of these pictures I'm going to show you are reconstructions. They might not be, exactly historically what the temple was. But I like this first one in particular because it shows you kind of where the temple would sit in relationship to the rest of Jerusalem. So Jerusalem's on a little mountain, Mount Moriah, and the temple was built up here on the sort of highest part of the city. It's extremely imposing. We know about skyscrapers, and some of you probably grew up in big cities. But in the ancient world, for the most part, everything happens within about 15 feet of the ground. It's kind of hard to build something bigger than 15 feet. Until we get these monarchies that start building public buildings. And the temple would be one such building. You would walk into Jerusalem. It's kind of like the first time I drove into Chicago, and we're driving in from the south, and you eventually start to see the skyline pick up over the lake. And you're like, whoa, that's huge. That's what you would see as you're going to Jerusalem, or if you live around Jerusalem in that regard. Okay. Now, these are a couple of like diagrams based on what we have in the text, but this is kind of to show you how it sort of works out. So in the temple here, the temple is continually rising up. But we also have palaces, throne rooms, all of this stuff for the king to sort of do his work in. The temple is up here at the top. And this is what the temple would look like from the top down. And we have outside is this big bronze vat called the Brazen Sea. In here, the holy place, the greater house, this is where priests are offering sort of the monthly offerings to Yahweh. This is where the king would come if he was going to do a sacrifice. And then further back in, we have the Holy of Holies, which is where the Ark of the Covenant gets deposited. Now, this is a rendering of what it might have looked like based on some other temples we've seen. A bit more modest in that sense, but you got to keep in mind this would be decorated. It's kind of like whenever we see ancient Greek architecture, it's all white and you're like, oh, so boring. No, it's vividly painted back in the day. The paint's just all worn off and all of that. So this would be painted. It'd be adorned in gold. There'd be fires burning around it. There'd be the smell of animals sacrifices and meat cooking and incense and all of that. So it'd really be kind of it's a very mystical place in the ancient world. Okay, but one thing I want to talk about in regards to Solomon is that we get in Solomon's all this portrayal of the grandeur of it. We have a literary golden age. Now, a golden age is beset by a problem, which is that if there is a golden age in the past, why are we not still there? What went wrong in order for us to not be in the golden age, right? Everything should be fine. So in these chapters 3 to 10, what we see, the temple is built and dedicated and starts, sort of working in Israel. The prosperity is going on. We have the Queen of Sheba story where she comes and is sort of in awe of Solomon's wisdom and how great everything is. Growing reputations, territorial gains. Solomon was sovereign over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines, even to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. Now, this historians and most other anthropologists would say is something that never really happened. But the Golden Age, its point isn't always to just communicate direct historical fact. It's to talk about ideals and what we should strive for as a culture. So Solomon was probably the highest point in the United Monarchy's sort of extent and in terms of its, we could say, pomp and circumstance in that regard. Things are going great. Are they going as great as we have in the text? As historian might be like, well, let's bring it back a little bit, but they're going great. That's what's important. But this middle section of Solomon's portrayal in the text is surrounded by two sections where this golden age, kind of the things that enable the golden age are made clear. So the first two chapters are kind of a bloodbath. Solomon and Bathsheba are having to get rid of potential rivals. They're having to banish high priests. And in this sense, Solomon isn't the wise, peaceful, Yahwistic king that we see in chapters 3 through 10. He's having to do some shady stuff a little bit to make sure that he becomes king. And then in the second part is where we see the other bracketing of Solomon's golden age. In these second chapters, or in chapters 11 through 12, we're told Solomon has about 700 wives and 300 concubines. And he has, Egyptian wives, Hittite wives, Philistine wives. We're actually not told explicitly that he has an Israelite wife. It's assumed that he did, but we're not told that. And these foreign women in the chapters are sort of shown to lead Solomon off the path that he was in this middle section of the Golden Age. He starts building high places and other temples to other gods. There's a section where he says they follow all these gods, the abominations of these people, Astarte, Milcom, Chemosh, Molech. And there's this section where it says his heart was not true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. And so what these sort of sections are doing is explaining or sort of tilling the ground for what's about to happen, what we're going to read for next class, what we're reading is the splitting of the kingdoms. The Davidic dynasty was chosen by Yahweh in the same way that Abraham was chosen, to be the kings of Israel forever. But nonetheless, the kingdom split at some point. And one of the ways that the Deuteronomistic history sort of foreshadows this is Solomon's turning away from Yahweh alone. He's looking to other gods. He's talking to these foreign women and being like, oh, that's kind of an interesting ritual. Maybe I should do that. And that leads into sort of the direct end of the Israelite united monarchy. So that's a brief thing there about David and Solomon. Of course, if you have questions about it, bring them up in class and all of that. I tried to keep it short. It looks like I went a little bit longer than I planned on. But again, thank you all for being flexible this week. I am very excited to see you on Monday. And I hope you have a great weekend. Enjoy this beautiful weather we're about to have. See ya.